Thank you. And before I begin, I really would like to offer my sincerest gratitude to Professor Cristiano Mazet and Yan Wu for inviting me to be a part of the webinar. It's my first time sharing my research with practitioners of translation and interpreting. And so I've always really wanted to hear what this group might say to this work and how you might respond and help me kind of think through this. So, all right, so I'll begin. The fictional turn in translation studies, namely the depiction of interpreters in transfiction, is a conversation that has caught my attention as a literary scholar. However, I notice that much of the conversation uses literary analysis in the service of exploring the complex challenges of the profession, or in the hopes of improving it. Literature, nonetheless, is not obligated to serve such ends, or any for that matter. And I suspect that we could be missing out on a much larger narrative by concentrating primarily on professional needs. In addition, I find that the kinds of literary texts invoked by translation studies scholars tend to be ones about conference interpreters and other types of interpreters that are tied to the rules, ethics, and conduct expected of the profession. The type of interpreter that my work is interested in is not the professional, but rather ones that exist outside the frame of the profession. Therefore, and because I am neither a translator nor an interpreter, I would like to preface my talk with a statement that nothing I say should be construed as advice for the profession. But before you click Leave Meeting, what I would like to offer is an invitation to stay and listen to what I find literature does particularly well. That is, when we encounter interpreters in literature that are unmoored from rules and accountability structures, what kinds of interpretive acts become possible? And by who? How can interpreting inform activism? And how does literature enable us to reimagine the potential of the interpretive act to connect others in situations that are atomizing and inhumane? In this talk, I'm going to share parts of my book project entitled The Interpreter of Crimmigration and Detention, along with some more recent work that I am still thinking through. In this project, I propose that the intersection of criminal law with immigration law, what's called crimmigration, and its impact on increasing the rates of immigrant detention, deportation, and family separation in the US has led to the formation of a crimmigration subgenre in post-9/11 American ethnic literature. And so here's kind of a definition that I've currently settled on, still thinking through. But I think what the crimmigration subgenre is that it's a body of writing that limns the local and transnational effects of politically and racially targeting migrant groups, including both citizens and non-citizens, that directly and indirectly result from the passage of crimmigration laws. The subgenre marks the growing prominence of the Immigration Detention Center as a literary setting and examines the pressures the immigration system exerts on those who live and interpret within it. There are a few tropes that one can use to identify works that fall under the crimmigration subgenre, but the one that is the most important to me is the trope of using a bilingual character to tell the story. I would even venture to say that, given that crimmigration has found a foothold in multiple disciplines outside of its origins in legal studies, literature's contribution to crimmigration scholarship is to remind everyone that the immigration system is a highly mediated one, where interpreters and issues of interpretation become problems for thought. These bilingual characters are often thrust into situations where they may start off orally translating for interlocutors in an ad hoc manner, usually because such characters are already natural interpreters. Yet we must remember that in the English language, the word interpreting operates under two definitions. It can be an act of oral translation, and it can be an act of explanation, an act of making meaning. And when I think about that second definition, I am immediately reminded that narration is a kind of interpretation too. As the Mexican writer Valeria Luiselli famously writes at one point about her experiences as a volunteer legal interpreter in Tell Me How It Ends, an essay in 40 questions, I find myself not knowing where translation ends and interpretation starts. Many of the characters that I have encountered throughout my research undergo similar trajectories. Once they begin orally translating, the circumstances under which they translate force them to constantly slide between both registers of the word in rather extreme ways. Through my exploration of Japanese American, Haitian American, Chicanx, and Latinx literatures, this trend holds steadfast. The destabilization of interpreting in this literary archive not only stems from its doubled definition, but also from the larger narrative of interpreting that hangs over American literature and history. The United States, with its English-only movements and its perceived status as a language graveyard, to quote Mary Louise Pratt, does a lot to undermine its dependency on interpreters. And yet, when one begins to look for them in the American context, they appear pretty much everywhere. So some examples that I've encountered have included Indigenous people as interpreters in various forms of settler colonialism, the Chinese legal interpreters for detainees on Angel Island, the Nisei Japanese linguists of World War II and the Korean War, the Haitian Creole interpreters on US Coast Guard cutters at the height of the Haitian boat refugee crisis, and Spanish-speaking Border Patrol officers along the US-Mexico border. As one can surmise from this wide range of examples, the United States has to some extent depended upon the linguistic prowess of interpreters to carry out acts of settler colonialism, colonization, and imperialism, but more importantly, particularly in those last two examples, to define who should be included and who should be excluded from belonging to the United States, a key aspect of crimmigration. And yet the United States, among many other things, disavows how it instrumentalizes non-English languages for its agenda. As Michael Cronin astutely notes in Translation and Identity, a central problem of translation in general and interpreting in particular is that of control. Proximity is both sought after and feared. The fear comes from the risk of being misled either by the native interpreter or by the non-native interpreter gone native. The difficulty for the imperial agent is dealing with this monstrous doubleness, the potential duplicity of interpreters. That potential duplicity, or from the eyes of American institutions, it feels simply duplicity, is the very thing that haunts the contemporary narrative of interpreters and can make them problematic and even tragic figures as they appear in literature. Within American ethnic literature, nonetheless, the interpreter's potential duplicity is also tied to their racialized visibility. Interestingly, Cronin situates his statement about duplicity within the context of the War on Terror. The research done on Iraqi interpreters in the War on Terror, although certainly reflective of a particular context, contains implications that affect how one can understand the visibility of ad hoc interpreters of American ethnic literature. In Vicente Rafael's translation, let me go back. In Vicente Rafael's translation, American English and National Securities of Empire, Rafael writes about the Iraqi interpreter. Stranded between languages and societies, translators are also exiled from both. Neither native nor foreign, they are both at the same time. Their uncanny identity triggers recurring crisis among all sides. It is as if their capacity for mediation endows them with the power to disturb and destabilize far out of proportion to their socially ascribed and officially sanctioned positions. But it is a power that also constitutes their profound vulnerability. He follows, just by being who they are, translators thus find themselves stirring interest and sending out messages beyond what they had originally intended. Without meaning to, they generate meanings out of their control. And herein lies the problem of the interpreters of ethnic American literature. In a country where race is foundational to notions of citizenship and belonging, non-white characters working as interpreters in any capacity find themselves in vulnerable positions because their bodies, skin color, clothing, and what are called symbols of deportability are simultaneously sending out unintended messages as they translate. Those messages are then intercepted by their interlocutors, who, as the literary theorist Stanley Fish would say, and he's saying this about literature, but I'm repurposing it for interpreting, that those interlocutors are already coming in with interpretive strategies that predate the interpretive act. That is, to say in other words, the interlocutors already know how they are going to interpret the interpreter's embodied presence. Those meanings out of the interpreter's control may lead to linguistic impasses because interpreter characters find that they cannot speak over the much louder messages sent out by their bodies. If these interpreters are also facing their own criminalization, as they often do within the Crimmigration subgenre of ethnic American literature, then the interpreter faces what Lisa Marie Cacho has written about the so-called illegal alien. That is to say, to be criminalized is to be prevented from being law-abiding. One does not need to have committed a crime because the person is the offense in of itself. Criminality, real or imagined, hovers over these interpreter characters, recasting potential duplicity into potential criminality. According to the interpreter Eric Kamad Freitas, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, makes criminals out of the undocumented in order to boost its number of apprehensions, which ICE in turn uses to justify asking for a higher budget in the name of combating terrorism. Kamad Freitas, who served as an interpreter for the 2008 Postville raid, received criticism for publishing his eyewitness account of ICE's fast-tracking criminal procedures because of perceived confidentiality breaches. And yet, I think it is significant that over time we have received more writings by interpreters who have served in professional and ad hoc capacities within the Crimmigration regime, such as the author Francisco Cantu, who writes about his experiences as a Border Patrol agent. I think that these interpreters clearly seem compelled to continue interpreting what they have seen for a much wider audience. But at the same time that interpreters are writing and participating in recreating stories for films about crimmigration, others are systematically undermined and erased within immigration contexts. Such concerted efforts may range from the replacement of interpreters with recorded instructions in legal proceedings of immigration to the use of telephonic interpretive services in immigration detention centers, the latter of which can only be accessible with permission. Although I cannot share my research about immigration detention centers within the parameters of this talk, I will say that I have found testimonies from detained and formerly detained migrants that point out that detained bilingual immigrants who grew up in the US sometimes act in the capacity of ad hoc interpreters in light of kind of what seems like missing interpreters in these immigration detention centers. So these ad hoc interpreters have been crucial in reading documents out loud to illiterate detainees, paraphrasing the content for easier comprehension, and translating healthcare requests in legal forms. And of even more interest, I have found bilingual detainees who use their bilingualism to accomplish other types of mediation, including bilingual prayer groups and infiltration into detention centers. These bilingual detainees parallel the ad hoc interpreters of the Crimmigration subgenre. Whether or not these bilingual detainees are intentionally invoked by my authors, their presence offers a different means to break away from the narrative of potential duplicity, erasure, and impasse. Mona Baker has written that we need to understand how interpreters and how translators and interpreters participate in both circulating and resisting the narratives that turn the whos of our times into the its, whose suffering is either justifiable or at least simply regrettable. Thus, in this project, I argue that the interpreter characters in the Crimmigration subgenre resist such narratives by refusing impartiality in order to side with marginalized and criminalized groups. When faced with impasse, they take up alternative strategies that use interpreting, actions adjacent to interpreting, and even acts transcending language in order to continue the interpretive act, the one of explanation and connection. The interpretive act may begin as a linguistic one, but it eventually also encompasses a reinvention of the act in order to challenge the Crimmigration regime itself. In the rest of this paper, I'm going to engage with two works from the Crimmigration subgenre, Luiselli's novel Lost Children Archive and Karla Cornejo Villavicencio's creative nonfiction book, The Undocumented Americans. I've chosen to share this section of the project today because many activists, writers, and artists are taking up the task of documenting and memorializing crimmigration within the context of Latinx immigration. But profound disagreements arise over the most ethical method, or even question the possibility of representing and mediating the voices of people affected. This task becomes even more difficult to consider when it involves children. Children affected by crimmigration are already facing the reality that their supposedly inalienable rights to protection, family life, education, and healthcare promised to them by international law are actually unenforceable in practice, according to the lawyer Jacqueline Baba. The Latinx child in particular has been depersonalized and dehumanized by the mainstream media and government policies since they began appearing in large numbers at the US-Mexico border from 2014. The question of consent and the question of recourse, should the representation be inaccurate, surround the inclusion of the child subject. And yet, as I show in my analysis of Lost Children Archive and the Undocumented Americans, the Crimmigration subgenre can also include child interpreters as figures through which we can think through pedagogy, deferred and alternative futurities, and advocacy. What links these two works together is a future of entanglements via language, community, and care carried within the child interpreter who will one day become an adult. In order to delve into Valeria Luiselli's Lost Children archive, I must first explain the novel's relationship to its preceding work, Tell Me How It Ends, an essay in 40 questions, first published in 2017. In the essay, Luiselli shares her experiences working as a volunteer legal interpreter for the New York federal court system during the Obama administration in 2015. There, she translated on behalf of Central American refugee children in order to assist the immigration lawyers putting together priority juvenile dockets. Within my Crimmigration subgenre archive, Luiselli is the first character, so to speak, who approaches interpreting in a professional capacity. She is very attentive to the fact that she cannot influence the children to tell their stories in ways that would prevent deportation or influence the translation itself. And yet the emergence of the volunteer interpreter character is ultimately short-lived within the subgenre. In Luiselli's follow-up novel Lost Children Archive, published in 2019, which fictionalizes many aspects of Tell Me How It Ends, Luiselli's fictionalized self is not a volunteer interpreter, but rather a documentarian. This change may suggest a frustration on Luiselli's part about her experiences interpreting within a legal setting, as she seems to want interpreting to also be a form of advocacy, and that entails exerting influence over the translation. However, such a change should not be construed as a complete rejection of interpreting as a practice on her part. Rather, from this space of a perceived deadlock of impasse, we can read Lost Children Archive as a novel about rethinking interpretation through its second definition of making meaning, an act of explanation, as I will show in my analysis of 3 key moments. To briefly summarize the novel, Lost Children Archive is about an unnamed family that goes on a road trip from New York City to the US-Mexico border. The family is deeply invested in the Central American child refugee crisis. Throughout their trip, they try to document this unfolding event in numerous ways in order to find the most ethical way of telling this story. Lost Children Archive is held together by 3 narrative frames: the perspective of the woman, that is Luiselli's fictionalized counterpart, the perspective of the boy, her stepson, and an intertextual novella called Elegies for Lost Children that both characters read throughout the novel. The woman narrates the first half of the novel, but ends up conceding narrative control to the boy during a climactic scene in which both characters are fighting over the only pair of binoculars that will help the viewer see an aerial deportation of migrant children. Whoever witnesses the aerial deportation, the woman reasons, will be the one whose interpretation of the event will continue to live on within the family. Although she initially resents the boy for having taken the binoculars and refusing to give them back, the woman begins to encourage him to narrate what he sees by role-playing and asking questions. In this moment, the woman's actions evoke those of parents who teach their children how to practice switching between languages, except that her lesson teaches the boy how to make meaning rather than testing language fluency. This pedagogical moment is also important because these 2 particular characters in the novel are cast as ad hoc interpreters. The woman interprets for a mother whose 2 daughters are undertaking the journey from Guatemala to the US, and the boy frequently translates his younger sister's cryptic thoughts to his parents. While there is more to say about the boy, I would like to shift focus momentarily onto the intertextual novella Elegies for Lost Children, because it can help us understand how the novel's second half positions the boy as its narrator and interpreter. I argue here that the composition and translation of Elegies is actually where the novel reimagines the interpretive act as it intersects with advocacy. Elegies first appears in the woman's narrative as a part of an archive that she has put together. She tells us that the novella is written by an Italian author named Ella Camposanto and translated by Aretha Clear. Neither exist, as Luiselli was the one who authored Elegies. The novella is loosely based upon the Children's Crusade in 1212, but Camposanto's version takes place in what seems like a not-so-distant future in a region that can possibly be mapped back to North Africa, the Middle East, and Southern Europe, or to Central and North America. The children ride atop gondolas, for example, a word used in Central America to refer to the wagons or cars of freight trains. Each elegy, of which there are 16, is composed using a series of quotes, and these quotes are borrowed from different writers. That is, they are freely translated by the author or recombined to the point that some are not traceable back to their original versions. The translator notes that in this edition, tellingly published in 2014, the same year as that sudden increase in child refugees at the border, that she decided to translate all borrowed quotes directly from the author's Italian and not from the original sources. Therefore, readers cannot tell which parts were originally quotes. Each elegy reads as a single authored text. Elegy's approach to translation speaks to Luiselli's composition of Lost Children archive itself. Luiselli has noted that her writing process is between two languages. She says, "I always take notes in both languages for all my books because I inhabit both languages and I think both languages and I dream in both languages." In one interview, she described how she was trying to write Lost Children archive in two languages before she eventually settled on English. She has said that writing it in English and not Spanish, which is the language in which I speak to kids in detention centers or at court, allowed me to feel that I could write about all these things that I've been talking about with kids. She wrote paragraphs in Spanish, translated them into English, revised and wrote them again in Spanish, back and forth until she achieved what she wanted. She says, "I think some of the best passages of the novel are the ones I composed this way, because putting two languages in a certain kind of tension and relationship forces you to be meticulous." In the composition of elegies, and to a different extent the composition of Lost Children archive, Luiselli gets at the impossibility of retaining the integrity and distinction of voices and sources in the interpretive act, an impossibility that is not bad in all its implications. The historical dislocation of the Crusade within the novella and the inability to know the sources or even the quoted material of the text appeals to what the scholar Macarena Garcia Aveo calls the metaphor of translation that adopts different layers of meaning related to connectivity, including the translation between nations, cultures, and languages, the translation that takes place as a result of experiences being configured into narratives, as well as translation as the outcome of other people's stories being interwoven with our own. What bothers Luiselli and Tell Me How It Ends is that the interpreter is working within a crimmigration regime cannot help but reinforce borders and divisions between themselves and the migrant children. After all, crimmigration codifies difference, and the interpreter cannot exert any influence over the children's situations. These differences are further reified through the relationship that the reader has to the novel. Any sympathetic reader can become a potential beneficiary figure, but that shift only further crystallizes the us-them binary of English speakers helping non-English speakers. But the translation and composition of elegies serves as a reminder to explore connective points so that readers are not organized in a top-bottom relationship with the children. Rather, our connectivity should be understood as moments of entanglement that suggest we can all meet each other as we are, paying no mind to who is in a position to give and who is in a position to receive, intimately bound up, and where one action creates a ripple effect outwards. Lost Children archive reminds us again and again that imagining advocacy requires losing fidelity to one's perspective. In this reading, one might be led to think that the interpreter might actually detract from this form of relatability, since the interpreter's presence signals difference between the two parties. Nonetheless, I do not find that the novel is suggesting an erasure of the interpreter. In fact, Lost Children archive has a second version of entanglement that directly involves interpreters. This moment comes up in the most famous chapter of the novel, where the boy and his sister go to the desert to search for the lost children, only to become lost children themselves. So as you can see here in this picture, the events are kind of narrated in a single run-on sentence that goes on for about 20 pages. And so this is kind of one set of those pages. The chapter begins with the boy's first-person narration, but the narrative appears to transcend his perspective at some point. And what's interesting is that there's a lot of disagreement that arises as to whether or not we remain within his perspective in this chapter. But I do personally read this entire chapter as still within the boy's perspective, which I think has implications for interpreting. I have to say, explaining this part is really confusing, I think, and difficult if you haven't read the novel. So I'll try to kind of explain what I'm getting at, but it's also, you kind of have to read it, I think, to fully get the effect. So the particular scene that raises questions about perspective in all its dizzying detail goes as follows. So as the boy and his sister cross the desert, the narration zooms out from the two siblings to focus on the sights and sounds of their surroundings, as if we are in a documentary, kind of evoking the mother's job. The soaring movement of his perspective evokes the flight of an eagle, which is a reference to the stories that the father tells them about the Apache eagle warriors, and it also evokes the vantage point of a plane, reminding us of the earlier aerial deportation. Both of these stories constitute part of the shared language between the two siblings. Nonetheless, we begin to lose the boy's hand in the mediation of the narrative. Rather, we begin to experience everything through an expansive perspective where the first person converges onto the third person. In this third person perspective, we suddenly find ourselves in the world of elegies. So like the fiction kind of converges with the larger world of the fiction that it's set in, where 6 children are also trekking across a desert where nothing can be heard except the monotonous sound of their own footsteps on and on across these deadlands, never stopping because if they stop, they will die. One boy falls and cannot get up. Finally, he could just lie there completely still in the same spot where one morning, months later, 2 men who patrol the borderlands will find the bones that were his bones and the rags that were his clothes. We inhabit the perspective of the dying boy only briefly, soon transcending the constraints of time to witness this future. The boy becomes an X on a data map fashioned by a woman who lives in the desert so that she can keep track of the number of dead migrant children found. The perspective notes that the novel sitting by this woman's side was written by Dick Cheney's daughter and how Cheney served under President George W. Bush, who initiated Operation Jumpstart. After that, kind of to end this scene, we hear the sweeping sounds of the desert mingled with the sounds of death. Our brief inhabiting of each person's subjectivity emphasizes the kind of entanglement that Luiselli is proposing through the figure of the interpreter, a loss of fidelity to our perspective through a bird's eye view. When I consider theorists like Michel de Certeau or Maria Lugones, they associate bird's eye views with authoritarianism and strategies of surveillance. And indeed, I think reading this scene as narrated through the boy can make the perspective seem omnipotent and therefore impossible to carry out in real life. But interpreting studies, such as the scholarship of Claudia Angelelli and Mona Baker, does encourage a larger understanding of the potential narratives, cultural and otherwise, in which interpreters exist and work. So I love this diagram by Angelelli. I think it explains so much. This diagram shows us how different facets of the interpreter's identity, the interlocutor's respective identities, and the structures of society in which they exist all exert influence on the interpretive event. And note, of course, that these arrows are kind of going downwards, emphasizing that kind of influence. Yet this scene from Lost Children Archive revises this diagram. The interpreter is still being acted upon, but the interpreter is also doubled in interesting ways because they're able to simultaneously survey larger narratives, such as those that foment hierarchies and power children in more capacious ways than his parents do. Thus, the bird's eye perspective presents the possibility of not being locked within one's subjective view and instead promotes understanding that one is entangled with others in a way that begins to articulate an ethics of advocacy through interpreting. As I end this section on Lost Children Archive, I continue to find myself thinking about the boy and his future, particularly in relation to that moment of pedagogical exchange with his mother. What if his exposure to the lost children in the desert and interest in interpreting carry him into adulthood? That is, what if the boy could become an interpreter who can connect to and advocate on behalf of children while also retaining the capacity to understand the larger narrative of immigration in which he narrates and makes meaning? Lost Children Archive ultimately does not go down this route, but I do want to offer an example of a child interpreter who has grown up into an adult and interprets purely on her own terms, no matter what toll these interpretive acts take on her mental health. I'm talking about the author of the 2020 creative nonfiction book, The Undocumented Americans, and formerly undocumented immigrant Karla Cornejo Villavicencio. To briefly summarize this text, in The Undocumented Americans, Cornejo Villavicencio travels to 6 different locations in the United States to document the unique personalities, challenges, and stories of undocumented communities. This book does not tend to come up in conversations about interpreting, even though Cornejo Villavicencio was a child interpreter herself. In the final part of this talk, I propose that the influence of childhood on adulthood and interpreting plays a large role in Cornejo Villavicencio's usage of relatability, which is her version of entanglement, and its potential for rethinking care within undocumented communities through children. In the introduction of The Undocumented Americans, Cornejo Villavicencio positions herself as a former child interpreter who can relate to the experiences of other child interpreters and uses this experience as a kind of praxis for how she gathers information for her book. And so she writes here, I took notes by hand during interviews. After the legal review, I destroyed the notes. I chose not to use a recorder because I did not want to intimidate my subjects. Children of immigrants whose parents do not speak English learn how to interpret very young, and I honored that rite of passage and skill by translating the interviews on the spot. I approached translating the way a literary translator would approach translating a poem, not the way someone would approach translating a business letter. I hate the way journalists translate words of Spanish speakers in their stories. They transliterate and make us sound dumb, like we all have a first-grade vocabulary. I found my subjects to be warm, funny, dry, evasive, philosophical, weird, annoying, etc., and I tried to convey that tone in the translations. So she not only calls attention to the fact that she was a child interpreter, honoring that rite of passage and skill in her oral translation, but also to her literary education and identity as a writer by disclosing that she approached translation as a literary translator would approach translating a poem. In this sense, Cornejo Villavicencio elevates the child interpreter to the level of the translator by yoking the two together through her discussion of her qualifications and methodology. She also opens the possibility for metaphor, symbols, and other literary poetic techniques to exist within the book so that fiction can have a place in telling the story of her subjects. By making herself visible and calling attention to her translation style, she ends up creating a form of entanglement, again, what we might understand here as relatability, to her subjects, who in turn take on the complexities that she describes. These decisions affect her interpretation style and her relationships with her interlocutors because she ends up relating to many people that she meets. For example, Cornejo Villavicencio frequently sees her family members in other undocumented people, which immediately shifts how she interacts with them. One can palpably feel the intimacy and care in how she interprets on their behalf for the readers of the book. This is an interpreter who emphatically rejects impartiality because any of these interlocutors with their precarious lives could be her family, who are also all undocumented, except for her brother. Cornejo Villavicencio's strong inclination to relate to her interlocutors pushes the interpreter to her bare limits. In the worst of moments, it can devastate this interpreter to her core. In the best of moments, she articulates a thick theory of interrelatedness, of personal responsibility, of communal care. But importantly, Cornejo Villavicencio's interpretive act is forged from consistent movement between these highs and lows. To illustrate what I am saying, I'd like to continue exploring examples of children within the book. But I have to say that unlike Tell Me How It Ends, The Undocumented Americans is not exclusively about children. But what I find in kind of visiting this book is that her encounters with child subjects tend to elicit some of the most charged moments of her interpretive practice and how she articulates it. So in one chapter, Cornejo Villavicencio's encounter with a lead-poisoned baby pushes her to her mental limits, and it really is one of the lowest points of this book. This encounter leads to a paragraph that stands out in The Undocumented Americans because of its usage of stream of consciousness. I'm not going to read the passage out loud. I just kind of wanted to show you what it looks like, but it is kind of very different from any other passage that exists within this book. To provide, I think, some more context, in this chapter, Cornejo Villavicencio travels to Flint, Michigan, where she writes about the lead poisoning of the water and how it affected the undocumented community. There, she meets Ivy, a brilliant single mother, who recounts that doctors responded to her health concerns when pregnant by telling her to drink more water. Unable to afford bottled water, she drank the tap water. When Ivy's baby Lydia was born, the infant suffered from complications, including temporary blindness and seizures, because she, too, was poisoned by the lead that her mother was ingesting. Cornejo Villavicencio writes, "What I saw in Flint was a microcosm of the way the government treats the undocumented everywhere, making the conditions in this country as deadly and toxic and inhumane as possible so that we will self-deport." She essentially accuses the American government of perpetrating a genocide against Latinx and Black people. The chapter, which is already quite emotionally difficult to read, then shifts into this intensely psychological spiral in which we are mired within Cornejo Villavicencio's mental state, as indicated by this burst of stream of consciousness and shoot and shoot and shoot shoot. We know that interpreters can face vicarious traumatization and burnout, among other symptoms, when they are repeatedly exposed to interpreting on behalf of perpetrators and/or victims of severe human rights violations. But because Cornejo Villavicencio has no critical distance from her interlocutors, she is experiencing the pain so acutely that we, as her readers, vicariously experience it through her. If it is possible to be impartial while reading this book up until this point, then by the time we get to this section, it would be impossible to remain so. The encounter with Ivy and her baby evokes an earlier section of the book where Cornejo Villavicencio reveals that she has experienced irreversible damage to her brain as a result of having been separated by her parents as a baby. Although I have not yet had the chance to look into intersections between interpreting studies and disability studies, but if anyone has recommendations, I'd love to know. I do find myself thinking with Jasbir Puar on this disclosure about our interpreter in the undocumented Americans. In her book, The Right to Maim, Puar frames, quote, maiming as slow but simultaneously intensive death-making. And Cornejo Villavicencio is interpreting on behalf of maimed, undocumented Americans who have experienced life-altering illnesses and disabilities due to occupational hazards, environmental injustice, and the intensified fear of living during the Trump administration where this book takes place. But family separation, to quote the lawyer Stephen Lee, is a kind of slow death, and in relation to this next passage, it is a form of maiming. Cornejo Villavicencio writes, "Researchers have shown that the flooding of stress hormones resulting from a traumatic separation from your parents at a young age kills off so many dendrites and neurons in the brain that it results in permanent psychological and physical changes. One psychiatrist I went to told me that my brain looked like a tree without branches. So I just think about all the children who have been separated from their parents, and there's a lot of us, past and present, and some under more traumatic circumstances than others, like those who are in internment camps right now. And I just imagine us as an army of mutants. We've all been touched by this monster, and our brains are forever changed, and we all have trees without branches in there. And what will happen to us? Who will we become? Who will take care of us?" When Cornejo Villavicencio was a baby, she too was separated from her parents for several years while they worked in New York City, and she stayed behind with relatives in Ecuador. Family separation can take place in many forms, but what Cornejo Villavicencio disturbingly shows here is that the biological results are the same. The outcome of this state-sanctioned violence is encapsulated by a simple analogy. Her brain looks like a tree without branches, but the image haunts in its implications of stunted growth, of a future and a being permanently folded into and withheld in a trunk. This is the cold insight that we receive into the book's interpreter, and Cornejo Villavicencio is hardly alone in this matter. Research published around the time of the Trump administration's zero tolerance policy, which is a really important recent policy within Crimmigration, shows that children who were separated from their parents and then later reunited had already experienced irreversible psychological and biological damage to their brains. William Wan, a writer from the Washington Post, whose article Cornejo Villavicencio cites in her book, notes that family separation can destroy the child's ability to emotionally attach to the parent, which is directly connected to how children learn to differentiate between security and danger. Within this passage, Cornejo Villavicencio also references a much longer history of family separation in her invocation of "there's a lot of us, past and present," that goes beyond Latin Americans and includes Indigenous children and the children of enslaved Africans, for example. And though it casts those experiences under the optic of a generational and multi-ethnic mental health crisis. And this is, I think, Cornejo Villavicencio's bird's eye view coming through. Most of these children will grow up to become adults, so the army of mutants signals the arrival of a group of humans that the state has actively brought into being while simultaneously refusing to take responsibility for their care. Cornejo Villavicencio, as one of those children and on behalf of the children, asks those questions at the end of this passage. And I think one might also ask, what can interpreting even do for this situation? Cornejo Villavicencio offers one answer to these questions in The Undocumented Americans through what the scholar Crystal Perrick calls an aesthetics of kin. Perrick argues that minor literatures retain the right to family as a human right by imagining provisional forms of family flexible and creative enough to respond to the multiple threats and injuries that global modernity triggers. The aesthetics of kin, Perrick continues, highlights the multitude of affiliations by which social reproduction and care potentially can take place, where minor subjects foster affective, psychological, and bodily well-being in an ethics of intimacy, love, or duty. Cornejo Villavicencio taps into an aesthetics of kin by inhabiting different familial subject positionalities to help ameliorate the particular kinds of gaps and loneliness faced by the undocumented people she befriends. For example, Cornejo Villavicencio, in spite of her protestations against motherhood, takes care of girls whose father is claiming sanctuary in a church in Cleveland, and to these girls' mischievous delight, she does not correct people when they think she is their mother. The money that Cornejo Villavicencio invests into these girls, as well as into her own family and the community itself, also casts her as a surrogate breadwinner. Perhaps most intriguingly, nevertheless, is Cornejo Villavicencio's hope in the child figure, though. She writes, "I hope that they, undocumented adults, have a child like me. If I reach every child of immigrants at an early age, I can make sure that every child becomes me, and if they don't, I can be everyone's child." In other words, Cornejo Villavicencio positions the child interpreter as a future adult caretaker. This idea is not illogical because child interpreters can experience role reversal because only they can advocate on behalf of monolingual parents. Cornejo Villavicencio's declaration, "I can be everyone's child," posits that children eventually assume responsibility over parents. That is, the child caretaker's actions temporarily fill gaps of care within the architecture of the state. If other children can become like Cornejo Villavicencio, who in turn might teach other children in the future, then these caretakers/interpreters may be able to generate responsibilities that can hold undocumented communities together in the face of family separation, truly one of Crimmigration's most pernicious punishments, no matter how maimed or young they may be. In short, Cornejo Villavicencio appears to be proposing that if everyone can learn to relate to each other as a child interpreter would care for a parent, then a much wider network of natural interpreters, of ad hoc interpreters, can create a community of interrelatedness where distinctions no longer matter. Everyone would be accountable to each other and care for one another. And Cornejo Villavicencio, as a child interpreter who grew up to be an activist interpreter and a writer, shows that this future is already coming into fruition around her through her decision to relate to others as everyone's child, no matter what. So as a few words to offer a conclusion, Crimmigration law, policies, and practices will continue to affect refugee and undocumented communities and influence writers who are bearing witness to its ongoing life. Both Lost Children Archive and the Undocumented Americans imagine that bilingual children may serve as a catalyst for rethinking and experimenting with the interpretive act, especially within a crimmigration regime. In a way, child interpreters are primed to be in such a position. They mediate interactions with members of communities with which they have strong bonds and cultural ties. They also do not have the privilege of choosing among the interactions, settings, topics, and situations in which they interpret. But within and against these two circumstances, child interpreters in these two works still play with the interpretive act, laying the groundwork for the child to be an advocate, and potentially an activist in becoming. What the crimmigration subgenre's inclusion of child interpreters may be asking us then is to reconsider the commitments, philosophies, and relationality that interpreters are bringing into situations where children and their right to family is at stake. How do we, interpreters of language and/or literature, envision new modes of entanglement as a potential praxis for our interpretive acts in these uncertain times? Thank you.